Hello and welcome to IFN Podcast. My name is Vinita Tan. I am the editor of IFN, and today we are joined by Omar Mansur, the engagement lead of enterprise projects with Codebase Technologies. And together we will discuss about the digital banking landscape, especially in the context of Islamic banks. So thank you so much, Omar, for being with us here today. Let us kickstart with the biggest question. Obviously, what is the biggest challenge traditional banks face in their move towards becoming a digital bank?
Thank you so much, Vinita, for having me. Well, that's actually a very good question because this is the first question that most people basically ask when it comes to fintech and, in general, the banking sector with the technology that's involved. Most from my experience and from our past experiences working with banks and working with institutions that have been working with banks, it just breaks down to three crucial initiatives. One is the most critical one is moving out of your comfort zone. The second is basically having preset a digital mindset, the willingness to change. And then at the same time, studying your customers, what trends are happening, what demands are there, and then adapting. So if you basically take these three, not in the exact same order, you basically overcome a lot of the challenges. Because when it comes to transitioning from a traditional model to a digital model, it's never stuck on the technology itself. You could have the technology, you could have fantastic technology, but the thing is, if the people behind the technology are not up to speed or on the same scale as that technology, then it does not make any sense.
Absolutely. So it's a lot about paradigm shifts. And in your experience, obviously, code-based technologies work a lot with banks in Asia as well as in the Middle East. What Islamic financial institutions globally have made the greatest strides to embrace the future? Which one, have been willing to adapt and are able to research and implement the right strategies?
Oh, absolutely. Like now, if you basically look back at about maybe 3, 4 years ago, and prior to that, actually, just a little background about us as well. Since 1998, we've been trying to not follow what your traditional technology companies have been doing. So our business model is to continuously innovate because we don't see ourselves as a technology provider as such. We think of ourselves as a technology think tank. So we want to constantly challenge ourselves, and every technology that we or any solution that we basically roll out, we once it's rolled out, we try to find different improvements we can make to it, or how we can change the process, how we can optimize certain things. But going back to why these institutions or which institutions have made the biggest strides in the industry, I basically would like to single out three of them. One would be one of our own clients as well, which is Kuwait Finance House Bahrain. They basically released in 2018 their completely digital arm. Now, background about KFH Bahrain was they did a complete 180. They came from traditional banking background, and a lot of processes were still manual, etc., and so forth. And to them, it was basically like an overnight switch. So what they did was their own personnel inside adapted to the three crucial initiatives that I had mentioned earlier. They basically were ready with a digital mindset. They were ready to move out of their comfort zone, and they basically were definitely assessing their customers' demands and trends. And what they did was they came out with a banking platform that completely took the entire country of Bahrain by storm, and now allows the people over there to do whatever they want, whatever banking needs that they had, giving them the convenience of updating, applying for products, their day-to-day financial actions that they wanted to do. Like instead of going to a branch to do something, they literally could sit on their couch in between an advertisement of their favorite movie while watching TV. They could do all of these things. From open a bank account, do the transfers, apply for credit cards, apply for term deposits, manage their savings, etc., and so forth. All of this stuff literally by just their thumb, having not to speak to anyone. So this basically resulted in a lot of cost savings, a lot of process optimizations. The second for me was Maybank to You, because I had a nice conversation with some gentleman from Maybank, and they basically explained to me the whole concept. So I got curious and I wanted to study it even more. And it basically came out as like they understood what their customers wanted. They didn't want to be bogged down with an interface that was very complex or over the top or confusing or vague. So what they did was they tried to build their entire system to basically take into account what the customer wants. to me, addressing your customers' needs. I think that's a big step forward towards anything, because if you can keep your customer happy, your customer will keep you happy.
Absolutely.
And lastly, another one was Insha Bank by Baraka. They basically went into a market that they had no presence in, and they released a product that even they had never done before, and they became, you can say in a way, pioneers for that in Europe.
Absolutely. And now you've mentioned obviously very big names in the Islamic banking industry, but now we are also seeing the emergence of new Islamic banking digital startups. So the question is that are newer organizations, as opposed to traditional long established banks, better positioned for the future? Because people say they're more agile, so on and so forth.
Oh no,
What's your take on it?
absolutely. If you basically think about it, when you have these large Islamic firms, or you have large firms, the problem with large firms is and it goes with the same thing. When you have a physical object that's big, it tends to lose its agility because of its size. These smaller institutions that are coming up, they are basically very lean, they're very small, but at the same time they're able to a certain degree, do what these big institutions actually are doing. So what's happening now is that you have these big organizations working in parallel with these smaller organizations, either as a partnership or a joint venture, or literally just the big organizations funding these Islamic startups as well. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to channel the things that they can't do through these, and vice versa. So it's basically become more of like a symbiotic relationship in certain sectors, where you basically have the smaller firms taking advantage of these big firms. One of the best examples would be a banking license. So you have basically smaller firms that come out and they're allowed to do certain activities, but they're restricted on certain activities because they don't have the necessary license or regulatory approvals. So what they would basically do is then they would partner up and leverage on the license or the regulatory approvals or the controls or the governance of the larger firm, and then be able to fulfill what they want to do. So it's more of like a cohesiveness thing. You can't, these days...
A synergy between both.
Exactly. These days, what's happening now is you can't have... It's the time of having that one organization that gets big and like expands. It's not as common as it used to be anymore. Now you have basically alliances, strategic alliances, where you have organizations basically helping each other out, because as technology is changing, you have globalized banking as well now. You can't just have one bank be able to service everything. That bank basically has to make their alliances, partnerships, etc. and so forth, presences by doing or facilitating certain things that the general public wants.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Especially one would assume that these newer organizations, while they are nimble, but they are also not as well resourced,
Exactly.
and perhaps do not have the kind of network that these established banks have.
Both actually. Mm-hmm. Like if you look at the example of Waqfi, started off very recently, and they were one of the first Islamic digital banking service providers in Dubai. In Bahrain. And what they wanted to, and their ambition was fantastic. What they wanted to do is they want to redefine how banking services are brought across the globe. So obviously, when starting off, they would have their initial relationships, but in order to go to the next level, they needed to partner up with an institution that was willing to basically give them that chance. So they started working very closely with Kuwait Finance House, and that sort of helped them quite a bit as well, and it helped Kuwait Finance House as well, because Waqfi also helped them build their community banking for their Jazeel banking platform. So that was a very big plus. I'm pretty sure, like, if you basically are up to date with their news and everything, they've within 8 to 9 months, they're one of the few startups that have shown so much progress in such a short period of time.
Mm-hmm. And now let's take a look then at institutions who are not traditionally financial institutions. Let's talk about, say, like Google, PayPal, Amazon. These are seen as serious competitors to banks, especially when it comes to, say, digital and data revolutions. So what's your take on this? How do you think banks should respond?
Oh, absolutely. I think, in my opinion, if you look at how Google, Amazon, and PayPal basically have come into the market, if you study what they originally were, Google was just a search engine that would just provide information. Amazon was basically an online retailer, and PayPal was basically a digital payment mechanism that basically allowed people to not use their physical debit cards, or countries where you could not use inter-country transactions. So PayPal basically said, look, what I'll do is I'll allow you to buy that thing that you want, etc. and so forth. I'll minimize your risk, and I'll make sure your credit card works, etc. and so forth, and you can do all of that stuff. So that sort of helped them quite a lot. Now what happened is with banks, what these organizations started to do, as you can see in the global landscape, regulatory authorities and a lot of central banks have started to make a lot of banking practices very lax. So it's becoming now to the point where if you have the right capital, the right knowledge, and the right documentation that says you're going to do exactly what you're going to do, and it does not conflict with anything, you can do certain financial practices. Now, that for me is a huge leap up ahead.
You've also mentioned lax regulations, which is interesting considering the fact that there are indeed new legal changes, including in the EU market, new directives, new legislation dealing with the fintech industry. Now, do you view all of these as a threat or as an opportunity for
No, absolutely.
sector?
Now, that depends from organization or person to person. If you basically think about, if you feel threatened about something and you give up, then that's up to you. But to us, like at Codebase, what we basically see everything as, if we see as a lax regulation or a new regulation around something, we don't think of it as a threat. We think of it as a workaround, or we think of it as an added opportunity. Maybe today it might not work, but guarantee tomorrow it will. So it all depends on a matter of perspective. Now, it's inevitable that all these regulations and all these things that are coming out, they will severely impact, because now you have a lot of non-financial institutions getting into the financial institution game. Like as we mentioned earlier, you have Google coming into this. You have take Amazon and Google. They're not or Apple. They're not financial institutions, but now they're coming into it. Banks are getting threatened because they were never customer-centric. So these companies started to take things into their own hands. Now because of that, you have central banks and all these. They say, hey, he's not doing anything wrong, but we need to have some control in this, because as with any action or anything any business process or anything you have to do, you have to have certain controls to make sure that you maintain the status quo. With these new regulations coming out as well, they've started enabling a lot of non-financial institutions or smaller financial institutions to be more flexible, offer a better service, innovate a new process or way of doing things. So that's helped shape the economy, the whole digital economy as we see it today.
And in your opinion, then, what would be the biggest change we are going to see in the banking sector, Islamic banking sector in particular, over the next, say, 3 to 5 years?
Well, it's not just one big change. I think the Islamic banking sector has started to embrace a lot of new technologies, a lot of new initiatives. So, I mean, traditional banks were always ahead of their stuff because they had access to newer technologies that were not applicable to Islamic banks, etc. and so forth. So they always had that one step ahead when it came to technological fluency. But now what Islamic banks are doing is they're leveraging the power of Islamic fintechs to basically get that leap, and either be on the same speed or on par with the traditional banks or go ahead with them. One of the biggest changes that I'm actually looking at is complete digitization of traditional processes. Complete automation, where you basically have as minimum human contact as possible from the back end. Like you basically have complex rule engines and systems that basically process all this information within seconds or milliseconds, rather than have somebody sit there, analyze it, assess it, send it for approval, etc. and so forth, go back and forth, and then finally you receive your yes or no for that loan application that you did or for that financing application that you wanted. But it's inevitable, because I think it'll be here far before 3 years or 5 years. I think it should be here in the next year or two, or maybe end of this year. You never know, because technology is progressing
so fast,
much faster than it originally was thought out to be. You have all these talented people just coming up with these really new ideas and new ways of doing things, thinking outside the box, where you'll have somebody who's done video games or does video game programming and stuff, and he would basically bring the principles or whatever logical thinking he did in coding that game, he tried to bring it into an enterprise system as well, and he says, hey, why don't we use the rule engine from this video game to basically do something like this? So it will be not only more dynamic, it will allow faster blah, blah, blah processing, and then you basically have a financial system that whose rule engine basically got inspired by something that was completely non-financial or had got nothing to do with business technology to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest thing I'm actually seeing is that banking services will no longer be seen as banking services. They'll be seen as lifestyle services, because banks have started to not only go digital as well with their initiative, but they've started to adopt more banking services that embed into the customer's lifestyle. So it's now become, it's not called digital banking anymore. They're calling it digital lifestyle banking or just lifestyle banking.
So talking about, technology being a fast evolving sector, what then is Codebase targets for this year?
We basically are working on numerous projects, and none of them are of the same nature. So what we basically have started to do is we started to upscale not only our manpower size, but at the same time our capabilities, where we are now deeply getting involved towards technologies that are involving artificial intelligence, machine learning, blockchain innovations, integration of eKYC with non-financial and non-telecom services as well, development of new technologies to not only complement our current technologies, but be able to not address not just the financial industry, but every other industry as well. We are now venturing into the healthcare industry as well, because we have our own proprietary systems that we have just developed, and what they're doing is now they're creating new technologies for management of healthcare institutions, optimize their operations, and at the same time start building trend analysis, rule engines, etc., and so forth for the pharmaceuticals, and much more. I mean, I think this one question, if we go into this, I think it would just
Well, let's talk
go
about
on and on.
talk about geographical expansion. Then, are you guys looking to expand into any other
Yes,
markets?
absolutely. In 2019, we are going to establish our physical offices in Malaysia, UK, and hopefully in North Africa as well,
Okay.
or in the African region as well.
Excellent. All right. So one final question before we wrap up. What would your advice be to somebody, setting up either a digital banking startup or an Islamic financial institution looking to boost their digital banking capabilities this year?
One word: research. Research is key, because the last thing you want to do is announce to the world that you've created the first of something, or you're doing something new, and realize that somebody already had done this before.
But thank you so much, Omar, for spending time with us. We really appreciate your thoughts. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Omar Mansur, the engagement lead and enterprise projects with Codebase Technologies.
Thank you so much for having me.